These last 2 weeks I've made 2 videos, 2 of my most important videos in my view, where I explore in detail what it means for something to be a binary or spectrum. Since many people argue over whether sex is a binary or a spectrum, I thought it was worth making a video exploring what these 2 terms mean in detail, especially since, as far as I can tell, nobody else has ever done this before. These videos will probably prove very useful going forward because if I now see somebody refer to sex as a spectrum and argue that makes sense, I can refer back to those videos and say that they basically provide the full details on why that person's wrong. But unfortunately, I'm also sure I'll have to continue to give summaries of the basic points in those videos for the benefit of those who will insist that I'm wrong about binaries and spectra while not even being bothered to go back and look at what I've actually said about it in detail. So if I had to summarize my videos in 2 basic statements, one about binaries, the other about spectra, I'd probably say something like this. Regarding binaries, the biggest mistake people make is thinking that what we're concerned with is an aggregate of attributes, where, in order for something to be a binary, all of those attributes have to reliably fall into line on one side, when what actually matters is the function that the presence of those attributes speaks to. And if that function is part of a system where there are only 2 possible roles that something can have, then that is a binary system. Regarding spectra, the biggest mistake people make is thinking that if something is complex and variable, then it must be spectral and can't possibly be a binary. In reality, pretty much the opposite is true. Binaries are actually better able to deal with complexity and variability because you can have near infinite variability on either side of the binary. By contrast, spectra actually have to simplify things by taking all of this variability and complexity and reducing it down and compounding it to one singular continuum. One of the ways I communicated this in my video, which I was particularly proud of, was looking at the number line. The number line is a spectrum, and it's simply a list of all real numbers. This is how we do some of the most basic maths that we start learning when we're first at school. This is the maths that we do counting on our fingers. On the other hand, if you know something about maths, you probably know that there is such a thing as imaginary numbers, and from these imaginary numbers, we then get complex numbers. Now, if spectra are supposedly the best way to understand and display complexity, I have a very simple question. Why is it that complex numbers aren't on a spectrum? They aren't found on the number line. Well, the simple answer is that spectra aren't very good at dealing with complexity. 2 + 2 = 4? Yeah, spectra can deal with that. But if you want to get into calculations featuring the square root of -1, you're going to have to actually start to think beyond the spectrum. With this said, it's not a good sign that at the very start of the crash course biology video, Gender, Sex and Sexuality, What's the Difference?, the narrator says this.
Many people and societies think of sex as split across 2 tidy boxes, male and female. But life in all of its glorious complexity tells another story.
So right away we have the association between 2 boxes and things being tidy, and the suggestion that life's complexity should mean that we actually have to look beyond this 2-box model. Now, I'm a big fan of complexity, but I'm not seeing any strong reason to conclude that this complexity means there aren't only 2 functions in anisogamous sexual reproduction that associate with the large gamete and with the small gamete. You can have lots of different things that are all very varied, but still perform the same function in a system. Now, of course, life is pretty big, and if we're talking about all life, that includes asexual reproduction as well as isogamous reproduction where the gametes are the same size. Now, obviously this video is about biology, so I'm sure it won't have a massive socio-political focus, but I will just point out that if it were to have a massive socio-political focus, hypothetically, then obviously within that context, what would really matter is human sex, not all possible ways that reproduction can happen in life. And scientifically, we can say that sex in human beings is always binary and always firmly immutable and unchanging, as it is for all mammalian species. But I am interested in learning more about life's glorious complexity.
There are these fish called Australian gobies that all start out as female, but later some start producing sperm while still having cells that can become eggs.
Okay, cool. So we probably all already know this story. In Finding Nemo, after Nemo's mum dies, Marvin should technically have become Nemo's new mum, because clownfish are sequential hermaphrodites, where if a female dies, a male will then become female to take her place. This is, of course, the only scientific inaccuracy in Finding Nemo. But in this case, we're looking at a different fish, presumably because clownfish aren't gloriously complex enough. They're sequential hermaphrodites, where a male changes to being a female and stays like that, and after becoming a female, has no ability to facilitate the role of the small gamete in sexual reproduction. That obviously doesn't contradict the binary, it just shows that a male can switch to being a female. Like anything in a binary system, or lots of things in a binary system, can switch from one role in that binary system to a different role. It's still a binary system, because if you're switching from one role to the other role, you still only have two roles. But these Australian gobies are different. Not only do they change from female to male, but once they've become male, apparently they still have cells that can change into ovum, suggesting that they might actually be simultaneous hermaphrodites rather than just sequential hermaphrodites. Indeed, the narrator goes on to say,
So in one lifetime, they can be female, then male and female, then female again. It's not a static either-or thing.
Okay, it's definitely not static, I'm with you there. The existence of sequential hermaphrodites proves that. I am a bit confused though, because he says that they go from female to male and female back to female again, which is weird because he didn't say that initially. He hasn't set up that they have the ability to switch back to being female. All he said was
that all start out as female, but later some start producing sperm while still having cells that can become eggs.
So they go from female to producing sperm, but there's no mention of them becoming female again. Could it be that he's maybe burying the lead about something here? So I went onto their source document and looked for this video and I couldn't find it. What I instead found was a list of sources for the video called Sex and Gender in Humans. Okay, I guess at some point they realized that fish aren't human beings, so they decided to change the title. Anyway, there you'll find two links about gobies. One from genderinclusivebiology.com, where they only do the most rigorous science, and another actual academic article that costs £30 to read. I do not know how much money I would need to be making from this channel in order to justify spending £30 to read an article to debunk 10 seconds of a video. However, if you want to help me achieve whatever amount of money that would be, feel free to give on Patreon, and I will say a massive thank you now to those who currently support what I'm doing on Patreon. You are tremendously appreciated. Thank you. However, I have a strong suspicion that he is being a bit misleading when he says they have cells that can become eggs, because what I think he's actually talking about is that they have oocytes which can develop into ovum once the fish switches back to being female. This is why he says they go from female to male with dormant cells that can become female, and then they go back to female, because that last step of going back to being female is necessary. They start off female and can produce ovum. Then, when they switch to being male, those oocytes lie dormant, and then, if they switch back to being female, then those cells can develop into eggs. By the way, this is based on a conversation I had with somebody who does know a thing or two about biology, but I couldn't find a great academic source for the claim because it's quite a specific claim to find a source for, and quite a specific claim for a given paper to have explicitly made of they start off female, then as males they have these dormant cells, and the dormant cells can only become eggs once they switch back to being female. What I will say though is that this coheres with his wording in the video, where he very specifically says they start off female, then they produce sperm and have these dormant eggs, and then they go back to being female. If going back to being female is necessary for what he's saying to be true, that would explain why he says they go back to being female.
They can be female, then male and female, then female again.
Also, insofar as I could financially afford to check their sources, they didn't say that these gobies produce these dormant cells, and then they can develop into ovum while the gobies are still able to produce sperm. Of course, even with this said, the definition of sex being entirely centered around gamete production is a little bit simplistic. A more useful definition is to talk about the gamete size around which the body is organized to facilitate the reproductive function of. Significantly, this would mean that just because you can produce a large gamete, that doesn't mean your body is able to gestate it. Even if I could produce a large gamete, that doesn't mean I could actually facilitate the role of that large gamete in sexual reproduction, because my body is not designed to do that. It's not organized around the function of doing that. My body is organized around the function of the small gamete. So even if I could produce a large gamete, that wouldn't change the fact I'm still biologically male.
And that's just the start of life's binary-busting rainbow.
Oh good, there's more.
There's a plant called tropical ginger that switches between male and female every afternoon.
That just sounds like another example of sequential hermaphroditism, and it's even less binary busting because there isn't even the implication that there's any sort of simultaneous hermaphroditism going on here. Just to clarify terms, sequential hermaphroditism doesn't destroy the binary any more than a light switching from on to off destroys that binary. If I have a piece of binary code and I delete a 1 and change it to a 0, that doesn't stop it being binary code, no matter how many times I switch from a 1 to a 0. Simultaneous hermaphroditism is much, much rarer, but it does actually prove there are some organisms that are not binary because they are able to actually facilitate the function of both gamete sizes in sexual reproduction.
Many kangaroo rats have both a vagina and a penis.
Okay, this is interesting in that most examples of hermaphroditism are miles removed from mammals. Having said that, it's not that interesting because simultaneously, just having a vagina and a penis is also quite far removed from being in any meaningful sense a hermaphrodite. Again, a simultaneous hermaphrodite needs to be able to fully facilitate the role, or at least have the appearance of developing to facilitate the role of both gamete sizes in sexual reproduction. Just having a vagina and a penis falls far, far short of that. I'm not going to read a whole academic article for every example given, but even the title of this article I found in the Southwestern Naturalist describes it as pseudo-hermaphroditism.
And forget male or female, the split-gill fungus has over 20,000 sexes.
Okay, I must admit I'm confused by that. I'm not sure how a fungus could have 20,000 sexes. I'd like to see a more detailed explanation of what's meant by that. In fact, now I think about it, this is a video largely about the complexity of sex. I'm sure we will get a detailed explanation of what biological sex is and why we should categorize it the way we do, as well as a full and complete profile on why these organisms evolved to sexually reproduce the way they do and what the function of that system is, so I look forward to that. In the meantime, I'll just say that a fungus is the exact type of organism that we would expect to sexually reproduce in a very strange, unique way, a way that has no resemblance to and no real relevance to the sexual reproduction of mammals.
And the evidence for sex as a continuum isn't just found in fish and fungi, but in us too.
Oh wow, that seems like quite a bold claim, considering how far, thus far, you've had to remove the discussion from human beings in order to find examples of genuine hermaphrodites. Fish and fungi are not humans.
This episode, we're talking about sex, gender, and sexuality. And the first thing you need to know is, they're not all the same thing.
Okay, so far, not that controversial. These three things are radically different, even while being related, just like humans and fungi.
Gender, for example, is totally unique to humans.
Now, hold on a minute, I'm not sure that's entirely true. I just read a whole load of articles about hermaphroditic fish, and I remember the word gender being used once or twice. For example, in Sequential Patterns of Sex Allocation in Simultaneous Hermaphrodites, Do We Need Models That Specifically Incorporate This Complexity? Colette St. Mary declares, fitness advantages associated with switching rapidly and successfully between behavioral genders may be key in maintaining simultaneous hermaphroditism. What is gender? Well, the clue is in the quote there. Behavior. it's about the roles and expectations placed on organisms that corresponds to their sex. While gender exists in a much more pronounced sense in human beings, it's a bit ignorant to say it only exists in human beings, as if human beings are the only social animals and other animals don't have social structures such that they can also have socially imposed roles and expectations. You can say it's only gender if it exists in human beings if you like, but since we find something very much like gender all across the animal kingdom, it seems a bit weird to not at least acknowledge that.
It refers to a person's inner sense of being a man, a woman, some other gender, or no gender at all. And it's about a person's identity and how it's expressed in relation to social and cultural norms.
Or, okay, I guess you could say that it's all just about your internal sense of self, but in that case, I don't know how you can claim to know that only exists in humans. Like, how did you find out that Australian gobies have no internal sense of themselves that corresponds to my sense of being a man? Also, hold on, isn't that first definition a little bit circular? You're saying that our gender is our sense of being a man or woman, but then you go on to say, or other genders, implying that man and woman are genders. So is our gender our sense of having a gender?
Some other gender or no gender at all.
Oh wait, hold on. Our gender can also be our sense of having no gender, meaning I guess gender can just be the reality of us being wrong. Because if somebody says they have no gender, you're saying that their feeling that they have no gender is their gender, meaning they do have a gender, meaning that they're wrong. And their gender is basically the reality of them being wrong. Also, my sense of being a man is very directly related to my recognition that I'm biologically male. Indeed, it extends from my belief that all adult human males are men. So, is that part of my gender? Does that mean that people are now obligated to respect my gender and accept that all adult human males are men? I'm not saying it's obviously wrong to define gender this way, I just feel like it needs to be thought through a little bit more, because some really basic questions are turning up a lot of problems. I, by contrast, would probably define gender as something like the social expectations and the performance thereof which emerge from sex role stereotyping. That seems fine to me. What is masculinity? It's the social expectations or the performance thereof that emerge from sex stereotyping, specifically of biological males, same as femininity is to biological females. And as for third gender categories that exist in parts of the world, they also emerge from sex role stereotyping. Specifically, they usually involve biological males performing the role typical of biological females. The definition offered up by Crash Course has no mention of sex at all, which is an interesting choice for a biology channel. Still, this video is nominally 1/3 about gender, so I'm sure we'll get a more elaborate and satisfying explanation of what exactly gender is later on.
And different cultures have different ideas about what it means to be feminine or masculine.
Wait, what? Why are you talking about femininity and masculinity? Maybe I'm crazy, but I thought that masculinity was widely regarded to fit my definition of gender that I offered, which is about social expectations, roles, and expression. But this guy is saying that masculinity and femininity is part of gender, and he defined gender as just your internal sense of self. But internal sense of self isn't what masculinity is, or at least that's not what most people think masculinity is. Me identifying as a man doesn't make me masculine. I'd have to shotgun a beer and punch a wall for that. But I guess in order to keep what this guy is saying internally consistent, which is only fair to him, we have to say that he's saying now that masculinity and femininity does line up with his idea of gender, meaning that masculinity and femininity and everything associated with that is entirely, again, about your internal sense of self. Geez, so far, nothing's got anything to do with sex or the social expectations of roles or behaviors. Wow, it really seems like these guys are very much committed to making it so we have literally no words to describe the material world. Just what you want to see from a biologist.
Like, some Native American groups have long recognized a third gender, which is sometimes called two-spirit. The Bugis people of Sulawesi recognize 5 genders, including one that transcends male or female. And many Western cultures today are widening their understanding to include people who are non-binary, trans, and more.
Okay, yeah, there are many different genders across the world. Usually, by the way, they're not about somebody's internal sense of self. Usually, they're actually externally imposed upon people. in this sense, they're really not at all comparable to the contemporary Western idea of trans identity, which is very much about self-ID.
Sex isn't an identity, but rather a way of categorizing life based on a range of traits, including what reproductive cells an individual makes.
Okay, that's a pretty vague definition. Yes, it is about this collection of traits, but why that collection of traits? Is it just arbitrary? Or is it that the presence of those traits speaks to a specific biological function that you don't seem to want to talk about?
This can seem confusing because we do tend to assign someone a sex and a gender when they're born.
Wait, so we assign people genders when they're born? So we say, this baby identifies as a boy. That's pretty presumptive, isn't it? Also, where did boys come from? I thought that gender was
A person's inner sense of being a man, a woman.
A boy isn't a man or woman, so I guess that's one of the other genders, or not a gender at all. Man, I'm glad I'm learning so much biology instead of wallowing in my previous belief that men are adult human males and boys are what we call men before they become adults. That was so confusing. Now I get to find out that actually boys are presumably their own gender category that we decide to call babies based on our perception of their internal sense of self.
Like when we say, it's a boy, or it's a girl, based on outward sex indicators like genitals, we're assigning a sex. But we tend to bring with that a suite of cultural expectations that are part of gender, like the specific colors or gifts that are typically brought to gender reveal parties.
Okay, wait, I'm confused. Man, I just keep getting confused. I guess the trans activists are right that really this stuff is a lot more complicated and confusing. So he says that we tend to assign babies as boys or girls based on our observation of their biological sex. Now, I'm going to be honest, I'm going to make a bit of a confession. That actually makes a lot of sense to me. Sure, this guy seems to think that actually what we should be recognizing is that when we talk about people being boys and girls and men and women, those are genders, and genders are our internal sense of self. And when we say that a baby's a boy or a girl, we're deciding that baby has an internal sense of self. But he's not actually made an argument for that position, even though it seems to contradict what a lot of people actually do. So you'd think he'd want to make an argument for it. So I guess hopefully at some point he will, but he hasn't yet. I mean, he said that he thinks being a boy or girl is not based on sex. So now he's mentioned the people who think that actually being a boy or girl is based on sex. He's in a perfect position to explain why he thinks that's an unhelpful or maybe harmful way of categorizing human beings. But, well, his main issue is that we tend to bring a lot of prescriptive judgments and expectations and imposed roles with our designation of people as boys or girls and later men and women. And yeah, obviously that's wrong. People should be free to live how they want and express themselves how they want within reason. But, well, what if we just said that whether you're a boy or girl, man or woman, is about whether you're biologically male or biologically female, and then we just didn't add all the sexist crap on top of that? What would be the issue there? Like I say, since a lot of people do think that being a man or woman is at least largely about your biological sex, I'm sure he'll explain why that doesn't make sense at some point, and not just say it's bad because we might also then decide to be sexist. Because obviously someone can just point out, well, we don't have to be sexist. That's an extra thing that might tend to happen, but we can still have the words man and woman mean what they've always meant and not add a load of sexist stuff on top of that. Like, obviously he's aware that that's a thing we can do.
And sexuality describes who someone is sexually attracted to, if anyone.
Okay, cool. Yeah, we'll get to the other stuff later. We still got a lot to cover with gender and sexuality.
The sperm-egg dichotomy is common enough among life on Earth and useful enough that it's helped us classify all sorts of life.
Okay, so he just said a load of stuff that I really wouldn't disagree with. I absolutely agree that one of the big benefits of sex categorization is it allows us to understand life, and that's a very strong point in its favor. My only real criticism is he makes it seem kind of arbitrary, as if like we just chose sperm and egg because we thought that was a useful way to divide people up, when it's really more about a much deeper, more fundamental and naturally ingrained system that exists in biological reality. Acting like it's just about sperm and egg is sort of focusing on the arrow instead of what the arrow is pointing to. However, I do understand people tend to talk about the stuff in simplistic language for the sake of, expediency. I'm not going to pretend I've never ever just conflated having a penis with being male and having a vagina with being female. I just think it would be nice to see from this video some recognition that our understanding of sex could be holistic and function-oriented instead of treating sex as if it's just an observation of a random smattering of various attributes.
You can't just boil it down to sperm and eggs, because lots of people don't produce either.
Yeah, so this is the issue. If you think it's just about eggs and sperm, then you run into the counterintuitive conclusion that I would stop being a male tomorrow if I stopped producing sperm. And obviously biological sex isn't just about gametes, any more than being alive is just about having a heartbeat. That's just one important thing that makes up a tapestry of a wider biological function. Function is the key word here. Our ability to recognize that just because something isn't doing something, it's still intended to do that thing. This is vital for example, fixing failing organs. Otherwise we'd be left saying, well, your kidneys are supposed to remove impurities from your body. But since you don't have an organ that's doing that, I guess you just don't have any kidneys. No, they do have kidneys. The kidneys just aren't doing the thing that they're supposed to be doing. There is a function that they are supposed to have that they're failing to do. If your doctor understands that something cannot be doing what it's supposed to be doing, then wonderful news, you're much more likely to survive organ failure. Also, as a bonus, your doctor will also be able to recognize your biological sex even if you're infertile. This is why my definition avoids all these issues. Is a male somebody who produces sperm? No. A male is somebody whose phenotype is organized around facilitating the function of the small gamete in sexual reproduction. I can say firmly that every organism that fits that definition is a male, and everything that doesn't isn't a male, with the only possible exception of some very obscure parts of the animal kingdom that are miles removed from anything remotely mammalian.
And when biologists study sex differences, they often look at averages for a sex. Average hormone levels, average anatomy, but those traits can overlap.
Okay, so this is exactly the wrong way to go about classifying biological sex. It isn't just an aggregate of attributes. If you say that, then you have to put all this stuff on a spectrum, in which case all of these wildly varying things have to be understood relative to each other on one singular x-axis continuum. We can make some interesting observations about biological sex by considering these attributes. For example, we can say that males tend on average to be taller than females, but we can only make that observation if we understand what a male and a female is prior to our observation of these attributes. So while yes, these observations matter, there needs to be something concrete you can anchor it to. Otherwise, you're just making vague observations about a category you've only defined by vague observations and thus gaining no real insights.
But I'm saying people with XX chromosomes, not women, and XY people, not men, because man and woman refer to a person's gender.
Why?
Which, as we discussed earlier,
No, wait, hold on. Why? Considering how significant the sociological categorizations of man and woman have been, I can't just buy this idea that we should suddenly switch everything on its head and decide that what actually makes someone a man or woman is just their say-so. Why don't we do that for other important things like race and sexuality? I mean, if I say that I'm gay, I guess most people might take me for my word, but if I say that I am gay and what it means to be gay is to be exclusively attracted to women and not attracted at all to men, then a lot of people would recognize that that is actually very wrong, nonsensical, and kind of offensive in the way it diminishes the oppression of gay people historically, who were oppressed as gay people. But if I say that what it means for me to be a woman is to be a masculine presenting biological male, how is that not equally nonsensical and offensive? How is that not diminishing the reality of women's oppression historically? People like me were not the victims of patriarchy. It is morally wrong to tell women that they must accept somebody like me saying that they are a woman. This is supposed to be a video about gender and sex, and yet so far nothing particularly interesting or informative has been said. We've had a load of random examples of complexity to sex without any clear overview on what exactly sex means, and when it comes to gender, we've had some definitions that seem to contradict each other and be all over the place, and now we've just had this claim thrown into the mix that when it comes to whether somebody's a man or woman, we should understand that entirely about gender and not about sex. And I'm not seeing any argument for why we should. Also, doesn't this make the definition of gender circular as well as the definition of man or woman? You said that our gender is in part our sense of being a man or woman, but now you're saying whether we're a man or woman is determined by our gender. So it seems like you've got a bit of a loop there, and that's what happens when you put the word you're defining in your definition. I am a man, and this is my gender. And my gender is my sense that I am a man, because this is my gender. And my gender is my sense that I am a man, because this is my gender. And my gender. What informative science.
Someone with XX chromosomes isn't always a woman, and someone with XY chromosomes isn't always a man.
It's really more about the SRY gene, which you haven't mentioned yet, but I'm sure you will, because imagine if in this video on biological sex, you didn't mention the most important and possibly the singular determiner of what makes somebody genetically biologically male. Spoiler alert, he doesn't mention the SRY gene.
But there's nobody out there who's Y0, because we all need at least one X chromosome to live. There are important genes in there that help the brain develop.
Wait until you find out we also need the sex binary to develop. Every single person alive right now is alive because a biological male reproduced with a biological female.
These variations along the sex continuum are called differences in sex development, or some people prefer the term intersex.
From what I've seen, it's mostly trans activists who prefer the term intersex because it allows them to pretend that there are people who exist between the two sexes. The term differences of sexual development is far more accurate in that it reflects the fact these people are male and female, just as male or female as me or you watching this video. They just developed differently.
And a person is about as likely to have these gene variations as they are to have red hair. They're present in about 1 in every 100 people.
This is very misleading. Yes, differences of sexual development are surprisingly common, but a lot of these are differences of sexual development that most people won't even realize they have, that don't impact on their lives at all. But you shouldn't group them all together and just say they're intersex and they're as frequent as red hair, because they're actually wildly different, and some of these are actually very rare and very serious and very dangerous. So to just say, oh, it's just this common thing, it's like saying, oh, diseases are common. Well, sure, but some diseases are having the flu and some diseases are life-threatening.
So yeah, sex is way more complex than male or female. It isn't determined by any single trait, and it's not turned on or off by any single gene.
Something being complicated doesn't mean it exists beyond binary options. Indeed, having more than one option speaks to how robust the binary is. There are multiple ways and multiple layers to how somebody can be considered male or female. Like, yeah, I'm not male because of chromosomes or gonads or genitals. It's about something much deeper than that. It's about the answer to a singular question around which gamete size is my body organized to facilitate the reproductive function of.
Sexuality doesn't fit neatly in distinct boxes. Someone can be attracted to the same gender, another gender, both their own and other genders, all genders, or none at all.
Okay, here's the issue with the whole gender equals self-identity equals whether you're a man or woman thing. People aren't sexually attracted to other people's self-identities. I'm not attracted to my wife because she identifies as a woman. Gay men aren't attracted to men's identities. What you're saying here contradicts so many people's lived experiences. Nobody is attracted to somebody else's internal sense of self-identity. That's not even something that someone else can perceive or recognize. You're just knowingly saying something that is clearly false here.
And while we don't need to look to other animals to justify human sexuality, life's diversity does help us understand our own.
Wait, how can non-human animals even have sexuality? You just said sexuality is about your attraction to somebody's gender, but earlier on you said that only human beings have gender. Like, okay, I'm not going to show all of it, but he goes off on this whole thing about how same-sex attraction exists across the animal kingdom. And it's like, shouldn't you have realized something is wrong when considering the fact that by your own definitions, what you're describing here of same-sex attraction has nothing to do with human sexuality, which according to you is only about gender. Like, you're talking about animals engaged in same-sex activity.
Same-sex activity popped up again in penguins, bighorn sheep, giraffes, and the same question simmered each time.
But you haven't provided any word that correlates to that same phenomenon in human beings. what is same-sex activity in human beings? What categorization is that? It can't be sexuality because you're saying that's about gender. I always thought biology was about the cold, hard recognition that we are animals like any other animal, and eschewed the idea that we have some sort of unique transcendent soul. But it seems like the new trans religion is making edicts now. Other animals are attracted to base, vulgar, biological sex. Us humans? We're attracted to people's internal sense of self.
But here's one thing that we like to say around here. Imagine others complexly.
I don't need to imagine people complexly. I can see that people are complex. I can observe the material reality of the wonderful, elaborate animal kingdom, and I can learn about it and understand it through material analysis and using these wonderful words we have to describe material reality. And I just wish you weren't so committed to bulldozing over that by holding dogmatically to the anti-scientific view that you are whatever you think you are. That's the ultimate irony, isn't it? For as much as this guy talks about the complexity and the myriad ways that we can understand reality, when it comes to the fundamental distinction between human beings, he's reduced it to the most simple delineation possible. Understanding sex as a binary with its own internal complexity actually takes work. It takes insight. Just saying that sex is an amorphous sludge of vaguely related attributes, and what really matters is just what somebody says they are, is intellectually lazy. But I guess the nature of a crash course is that you're trying to learn as much as possible without possibly having enough time to fully understand everything. Maybe some topics aren't meant to be crashed. After all, at the end of this video, we can now say that we have not seen any arguments for why we should understand sex the way they say, why we should understand gender the way they say, why we should understand the categories of man and woman as being about gender rather than sex. We also haven't seen any arguments for why we should understand sexuality the way they say as being about somebody's internal sense of gender identity, nor have we seen any argument given for why when they try to elaborate on sexuality, they immediately started talking about it in terms of same-sex attraction. Anyway, everyone, I hope you enjoyed watching. I feel like I should say some sort of summary on the fact this is clearly a channel directed at children that's supposed to be explaining things in a way that is simple and accessible but informative, and we really saw none of that in this video. They didn't even get close to achieving what you'd think should be their main goal. And actually, very little of it was even about biology, right? Like, most of it was about definitions, which is a bit more of a philosophical question. And when you do have scientists talking about definitions and categorizations, you will usually see them make a clear argument for it. You can find elaborate arguments for why we no longer consider Pluto to be a planet. You can find arguments for why we now consider birds to be dinosaurs. Is there a scientific reason why we should say biological males can be women? I've not seen anyone make that argument. Certainly this video didn't make that argument. I'm disappointed, but frankly, I'm not surprised. Anyway, everyone, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Please do all the algorithm stuff. I'm not going to list it all off, but you know what to do, and you know that it is actually very important that you do this stuff, especially for this video. Like I say, it's directed at children. There is a chance that children will see this and they'll be, they'll buy into it. And it could actually lead to material physical harm to children who buy into this, and then that sets them down the path of getting surgeries and things like that. And there is a chance, I don't want to sound too self-important, but there's a chance that they'd watch that video and then they'd see this video, perhaps in a recommended if it's doing well in the algorithm, and they'd watch this instead, and they'd realize that actually a lot of this wasn't really science. So, however they feel is however they feel, but they shouldn't buy into this idea that the science is backing up trans ideology because, well, we saw these people try to employ science in their understanding of trans ideology, and it just didn't really come across particularly credibly. Anyway, I assume you're also aware at this point, although maybe you're new here, in which case welcome, but you can give on Patreon, and if you do, that's very much appreciated. And to show my appreciation, you get an extra bonus live reaction video every single week. Here is a clip from the last live reaction video I did.
Zero expertise or lived experience in the field.
What do you mean lived experience in the field? The field is the nature of being a man or woman. Anyone who is a man or woman has lived experience in the field, right? Like, when I say a man is a man, how can you say that I, as a man, do not have lived experience in that field? When J.K. Rowling says a man is not a woman, how can you say she doesn't have lived experience in that? Like, literally, a man is not a woman. There's 6 words there. 2 keywords, really, man and woman. And J.K. Rowling's lived experience covers half of that. So what do you mean she doesn't have lived experience in the field? If that looks interesting to you, then of course you can get access to that and all my previous reaction videos, and every single week there's another one there. The backlogs just gets bigger and bigger, which means more bang for your buck, or however much you want to give. If you want to give more than a buck, that's very appreciated. So yeah, of course, check out my Patreon, see if you're able to give anything, and I hope you enjoy the bonus live reactions. I'll see you all next week. And my gender is my sense that I am a man, and this is my gender. And my gender is my sense that I am a man, and this is my gender. And my gender is I'm done.